World Literature, page 45, By Any Other Name. An adapted story by Santha Rima Ra. Literary terms are description, which is words that create a clear picture of a person, place, or thing. Selection vocabulary. Anglo-Indian is an English Indian, and that's English as in from England. Headmistress is a school principal. Glittered is sparkled or shined. Stubborn is firm. Civil service, having to do with the part of the government that deals with employment. Twilight is faint light after sunset. Whitewashed is painted white. Guarded is cautious or watchful. Sometimes challenges help us to grow stronger. Two Indian sisters try hard to fit in at a British-run school. The struggle ends when one sister refuses to accept their unfair treatment. At the Anglo-Indian Day School in Zarinabad, they changed our names. We were sent to this school when my sister was 8 years old. I was 5.5. The first day of school was a hot, windless September morning. Such mornings came often in North India. We stood in the headmistress's study. She said, "Now you're the two new girls. What are your names?" My sister answered for us. "I'm Pramila." She turned to me. "This is Santha." The headmistress had been in India 15 years. She still smiled at her helpless lack of skill when saying Indian names. Her rimless half-glasses glittered. The loose bun on her head trembled as she shook her head. "Oh, my dears, those are much too hard for me. Let's give you pretty English names. Wouldn't that be more jolly? Let's see. Now, Pamela for you, I think." She looked at my sister. "That's as close as I can get. As for you," she said to me, "how about Cynthia? Isn't that nice?" How does the headmistress feel about Indian names? Use your prediction skills and based on what she says, to determine how she feels. My sister was always less easily frightened than I was. She kept a stubborn silence. I said, "Thank you," in a very tiny voice. Pramila keeps silent. Imagine how it would feel to have someone change your name. We were sent to that school because my father worked in the area. As an officer of the civil service, he had to inspect the villages. His headquarters at the time were in Zarinabad. He made his shorter inspection tours on horseback. A week before the first day of school, we had waved goodbye to him. It was a stale, hot day after the rainy season. Such days were normal that time of year. An assistant, a secretary, 2 bearers, and a man to look after the bedding and luggage were with him. They rode away through the large garden. We turned back into the twilight of the house. We could hear the sounds of fans whispering in every room. Up to then, my mother had refused to send Pramila to the British-run school. She used to say, you can bury a dog's tail for 7 years and it still comes out curly. You can take the British away from home for a lifetime and they'll still remain narrow-minded. Diplomas from Indian schools were not thought to be any good in those days. In my case, the question of school had never come up. It probably never would have if Mother's good health had not broken down. For the first time in my life, she could not go on giving us lessons every morning. So our Hindi books were put away. We were sent to the Anglo-Indian school. The British ruled India for 90 years. The mother's comments suggest her belief that people do not change. I still remember that first day of school. At that age, if one's name is changed, one becomes almost 2 people. I remember having a distant interest in the actions of Cynthia. Yet I certainly did not feel I had to answer for them. So I followed the thin, stiff back of the headmistress down the porch to my classroom. I felt only a brief interest in what was going to happen to me. This was a strange new place they called school. How does Samantha feel about her first day of school? The building was Indian in appearance. It had wide porches opening onto a courtyard. Indian porches are usually whitewashed and have stone floors. These, in the style of British schools, were painted dark brown. In addition, they had mats on the floors. The mats seemed to add to the heat. I think there were about a dozen Indian children in the school. It held about 40 students in all. 4 Indian students were in my class. They were all sitting at the back of the room. I went to join them. I sat next to a small, serious girl who didn't smile at me. She had long, glossy black braids. She wore a cotton dress, but she still kept her Indian jewelry. She wore a gold chain around her neck, thin gold bracelets, and tiny rubies in her ears. Like most Indian children, she had a rim of black powder around her eyes. The cotton dress should have looked strange. All I could think of was asking my mother if I couldn't wear a dress to school too. It would replace the Indian clothes I now wore. What words describe this small, serious girl? I can't remember too much about what went on in class that day. However, I do remember how it began. The teacher pointed to me. She asked me to stand up. Then she said, "Now, dear, tell the class your name." I said nothing. "Come along," she said, frowning slightly. "What's your name, dear?" "I don't know," I said at last. There were about 8 or 10 English children in the front of the class. They giggled and twisted around in their chairs to look at me. I sat down quickly and opened my eyes very wide. I hoped that in that way to drive them off. The little girl with the braids put out her hand. Very lightly she touched my arm. She still didn't smile. Most of that morning I was quite bored. I looked briefly at the children's drawings pinned to the wall. Then I watched a lizard hanging to the ledge of the high barred window behind the teacher. From time to time it would shoot out its long yellow tongue for a fly. Then it would rest with its eyes closed and its belly throbbing. It seemed as though it were swallowing several times very quickly. The lessons were mostly about reading and writing and simple numbers. These things my mother had already taught me, so I paid little notice. The teacher wrote on the board words like bat and cat. These seemed babyish to me. Only apple was new and hard to grasp. The word apple is hard for Samantha to understand because she's never seen an apple. Apple trees do not grow in India. When it was time for lunch, I followed the girl with the braids onto the porch. The children from other classes were also there. I saw Primala. I ran over to her, as she had our lunch boxes. The children were all opening packages and sitting down to eat sandwiches. Primala and I were the only ones who had Indian food. Our lunch boxes held thin wheat chapatis and some vegetable curry. There was also bottles of buttermilk for us to drink. Primala thrust half of the lunch into my hand. Then she whispered fiercely that I should sit with my class. That was what the others seemed to be doing. Chapatis are thin pieces of bread baked in a hot pan. Curry is a combination of strong spices used in sauce for vegetables, rice, and meat dishes. The huge black eyes of the little Indian girl looked at my food longingly. I offered her some, but she only shook her head. She plowed through her sandwiches. I was very sleepy after lunch. At home, we always took a nap. This was usually a pleasant time of day. The bedrooms were darkened against the harsh afternoon sun. I would drift off to sleep to the sound of Mother's voice reading a story. Finally, the shrill, fussy voice of the ayah would wake us for tea. An ayah is an Indian nurse or a maid. At school, we rested for a short time on low cots on the porch. After that, we were expected to play games. During the hot part of the afternoon, we played indoors. After the shadows got longer... I lost my place. After the shadows got longer and an evening breeze came up, we moved outside to the courtyard. I never really grasped the idea of games that were contests, At home, whenever we played a game like tag, I was always allowed to win. Because she's the youngest, Mother used to tell Primula. I had often heard her say it, so I had no idea what winning meant. When we played twos and threes that afternoon, I let one of the small English boys catch me. This is what I was trained to do. So I was, of course, puzzled when the other children did not return the favor. I ran about for what seemed like hours without catching anyone. I ran until it was time for school to close. Much later, I learned my idea was called not being a good sport. I therefore stopped letting myself be caught. It was years later that I really learned the spirit of the thing. Samantha does not understand that she cannot always win a game. The other children want her to join in and play fairly. When I saw our car come up to the school gate, I broke away from my classmates. Rushing toward it, I yelled, "Aya! Aya!" It seemed like forever since I had seen her that morning. This wise, loving figure in her white sari had given me so much useless advice. All of it was on how to be a good girl at school. Primula followed more calmly. On the way home, she told me never to do that again in front of the other children. A sari is a dress worn by Hindu women in India and Pakistan. It is made from many yards of lightweight cloth. The cloth is wrapped to form a skirt and a shoulder covering. When we got home, we went straight to Mother's high white room. There we had tea with her. I quickly climbed under the bed and bounced on the springs. Mother asked how we had liked our first day in school. I was pleased to be home. I was pleased to have left that odd Cynthia behind. Remember, her name had been Cynthia because the headmistress had renamed her. So I had nothing whatever to say about school except to ask what apple meant. But Primula told Mother about the classes. She added that in her class they had weekly tests. These were given to see if they learned their lessons well. I asked Primula, "What is a test?" Primula said, "You're too small to have them. You won't have them in your class for donkey's years." She had learned the phrase that day. Now she was using it for the first time. We all laughed loudly at her wit. She also took Mother to one side to say we should make sandwiches for lunch. Not, she said, that she minded, but that would be simpler for me to handle. What is the real reason Primula asked for sandwiches? That whole lovely evening, I didn't think about school at all. I dashed barefoot across the lawn with my best friend, the cook's son. Together we ran to the stream at the end of the garden. We quarreled in our usual way. Then we waited for the night to bring out the smell of flowers. I listened closely to his stories of ghosts and demons. By dark, I was too scared to cross the garden alone. The ayah found me. She shouted at the cook's son, and then she scolded me. She hurried me into supper. It was a wonderful evening. It was a week later that our lives changed suddenly. It was the day of Primula's first test. I was sitting in the back of my class. As usual, I was only half listening to the teacher. I had started a rather guarded friendship with the girl with the braids. Her name turned out to be Nalini, Nancy in school. The other 3 Indian children were already fast friends. Even at that age, one thing was clear to us. Becoming friends with the English children was out of the question. Sometimes during the class, my new friend and I would draw pictures. We would show them to each other secretly. The door opened sharply, and Primula marched in. At first, the teacher smiled at her kindly, and then she said, "Now you're little Cynthia's sister?" Primula didn't even look at her. She stood with her feet planted firmly apart. Her shoulders were stiff as she spoke straight to me. "Get up," she said. "We're going home." What details help you see how brave and confident Primula is? I didn't know what had happened. I could tell that it was a turning point of some kind. "Bring your pencils and your notebook," she said. I went back for them. Then together we left the room. The teacher started to say something just as Primula closed the door, but we didn't wait to hear what it was. In total silence, we left the school and started to walk home. I asked Primula what the matter was. All she would say was, "We're going home for good." It was a very tiring walk for a child of 5 1/2. I dragged along behind Primula. My pencils were growing sticky in my hand. I can still remember looking at the dusty hedges and tangled thorns. They lay in ditches by the side of the road. I also remember smelling the faint perfume of the trees. I wondered if we would ever get home. Now and then a horse-drawn cart passed us. The women in their pink and green silks stared at us as we trudged along the road. A few workers and women with baskets of vegetables on their heads smiled at us. But it was nearing the hottest time of the day. Therefore, the road was nearly empty. I walked more and more slowly. I shouted to Primula from time to time, "Wait for me!" I yelled in a voice that became more and more cranky. She spoke to me only once. That was to tell me to carry my notebook on my head. It would shield me from the sun. When we got home, the Ayah was just taking lunch into Mother's room. She immediately started asking us questions. Her questions were all about what we were doing back here at this hour of the day. Mother looked surprised and very concerned. She asked Primula what had happened. Primula said, "We had our test today. She made me and the other Indians sit at the back of the room with a desk between each one." Mother said, "Why was that, darling?" "She said it was because Indians cheat," Primula added, "so I don't think we should go back to that school." Mother seemed far away. She was silent for a long time. At last she said, "Of course not, darling." She sounded displeased. Why is Primula upset by the teacher's comment? We all shared the curry she was having for lunch. Afterwards, I was sent off to the beautiful bedroom for my nap. I could hear Mother and Primula talking through the open door. Mother said, "Do you think she understood all that?" Primula said, "I shouldn't think so. She's a baby." Mother said, "Well, I hope it won't bother her." Of course, they were both wrong. I understood it perfectly. I remember it all very clearly, but I put it happily away because it all had happened to a girl called Cynthia. I was never really very interested in her. What do you learn about Santha at the end of the story? Okay, literary practice. Answer these questions on a separate sheet of paper. Actually, they need to go on behind your vocabulary, on the back side of your vocabulary for this story. Question number 1. What happens to Primula and Santha on their first day of school? Question 2. How does the mother feel about British-run schools? Question 3. How would you describe Primula? Question 4. What kind of person is the headmistress? Question 5. What causes Primula to walk out of school? Okay, what's in a name? The headmistress, and by any other name, decides it's easier to give Primula and Santha English names. Primula, whose Indian probably means first, is given to Pamela, which means all honey. Santha is renamed Cynthia, a Greek name for goddess of the moon. Giving a child a name is an important act. Some parents pass on their child's name that has been in the family for many years. Others may give a name based on a child's features or qualities. Often a child is named for a saint or for other religious person, such as Jerome or Mary. In Native American cultures, a child is given a name that relates to an animal, a dream, or a successful life event. Whatever the reason for giving a name, each name has its own meaning or history. For example, the name Philip means lover of horses. The name Theodore comes from the Greek meaning given by God. In Spanish, the name Rosa means rose. The Irish name Megan means pearl.